I remember the exact moment my marriage began to unravel. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of night where the wind strips the last stubborn leaves from the trees and sends them skittering across cold pavement. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through some paperwork from work, when my wife walked in, poured herself a glass of wine without offering me one, and sat down across from me with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing a speech for days. Her name was Natalie. We had been married for 6 years. Together for 8. She was 34, a marketing director at a mid-sized firm downtown. Beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful. Effortlessly, almost aggressively so. Dark auburn hair that she kept just past her shoulders, green eyes that could go from warm to glacial in seconds, and a confidence that had drawn me to her the moment we met at a mutual friend's rooftop party in the summer of what felt like another lifetime. I loved her, or at least I loved the version of her I had married. By that October, I was no longer entirely sure those two things were the same woman. "We need to talk," she said, and there it was. The 4 most exhausting words in the English language, delivered with the kind of rehearsed calm that tells you everything you need to know before the next sentence even arrives. "My name is Connor. I am 37 years old. I work as a civil engineer, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life calculating load tolerances and stress points, figuring out exactly how much pressure something can bear before it breaks. Looking back on that evening, I think I had been unconsciously applying those same calculations to my marriage for at least 2 years, measuring the hairline fractures, wondering where the breaking point was. I simply hadn't expected it to arrive on a Tuesday, over a glass of wine I hadn't been offered. "Okay," I said, and set down my pen. Natalie took a long sip before she began. She talked about feeling confined. She talked about growth, the personal kind, the kind that apparently required freedom of movement beyond the boundaries of our marriage vows. She used words like evolution and exploration and emotional claustrophobia. She had clearly spent time with a thesaurus as well as with her script. Then she arrived at the point. She wanted an open relationship. Not a separation, not a divorce. An arrangement. She was very specific about the language. She wanted the security of our home, our shared finances, our social life, our history, and the freedom to see other people. She said it the way someone might propose a minor amendment to a contract, reasonable, measured, as if she were presenting a business case rather than dismantling the terms of our life together. I listened to all of it without interrupting. That surprised her, I could tell. She had braced herself for an explosion, raised voices, accusations, the operatic kind of confrontation that she probably believed she deserved, because it would confirm that her feelings were valid and that I was the problem. But I gave her none of that. When she finished, I was quiet for a long moment. "Let me think about it," I said. The confusion on her face was worth everything that came after. What Natalie didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she had been so absorbed in her own internal drama for the past several months that she had essentially stopped paying attention to me, was that I had been doing a significant amount of my own living during that time. About 4 months earlier, I had joined a weekend hiking group. It was something a colleague of mine had recommended, mostly as a way to decompress from a particularly brutal stretch of project deadlines. I'd gone once thinking I wouldn't enjoy it, and then I'd kept going, because it turned out I needed it more than I realized. Fresh air. Physical exertion. The company of people who weren't absorbed in office politics or domestic tension. That was where I met Vivienne. She was 31, a landscape architect with her own small firm, and she had the kind of presence that I can only describe as grounded. Not quiet, exactly. She was funny and quick, and had strong opinions about everything from trail maintenance to urban planning to the best way to cook a proper risotto. But settled in herself in a way that I found immediately striking. She wasn't performing anything. She was just entirely, unapologetically present. We became friends first. That part is important, because what developed between us was built on something real. Long conversations on trail breaks, Texts about nothing in particular. A shared lunch one Saturday that stretched 3 hours without either of us noticing. I wasn't looking for anything. I was, at that point, still trying to convince myself that what I had at home was worth salvaging. But somewhere in those 4 months, without dramatic declaration or conscious decision, I fell for Vivienne in the slow and serious way that only happens when you aren't trying to make it happen. I had told her about the state of my marriage. She hadn't pushed or pulled. She was patient in the way that genuinely secure people are patient, not because they're waiting for an outcome, but because they're comfortable in the present moment, regardless of what it contains. She had told me simply that she cared about me and that I deserved to be in a situation that made me feel like myself again. After Natalie's proposal, I called Vivienne and told her what had happened. There was a pause on the line, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" "I think," I said slowly, "that I want to stop managing this gracefully and start living honestly." Another pause. Then, "I think that sounds right." The week that followed Natalie's open relationship proposal was one of the stranger periods of my adult life. She had interpreted my calm response as hesitation, and she had taken that to mean she was winning, that I was in the process of accepting her terms because I was afraid of losing her. She moved through the house with a lightness that I recognized immediately as relief. She was on her phone more. She came home later twice that week without explanation. She was, in other words, already operating as though the arrangement had been agreed upon. I watched all of this with a clarity that surprised me. The anger I had expected to feel, the jealousy, the wounded pride, was either absent or had already burned through at some earlier point when I wasn't paying attention. What I felt instead was something cooler and more final: certainty. I called my friend Patrick, who is an attorney. Not for legal advice, not yet, but because Patrick is the kind of person who gives you a straight answer when you need one. I told him what was happening. He listened, asked a few questions, and then said something I already knew but needed to hear out loud. "She's not asking for an open relationship, Connor. She's asking you to stand still while she moves on. Those are different things." "I know," I said. "So don't stand still." I didn't. On a Friday evening, 10 days after Natalie's proposal, I texted her to let her know I was bringing someone for dinner the following Saturday. Just the 4 of us and our close friends Owen and Claudia, who had been in our lives for years and had already privately expressed concern about the direction things were heading. I framed it casually. A double dinner, low-key, no big deal. I said I wanted her to meet someone I'd been spending time with. She read the message. She didn't respond for 40 minutes. Then, sure. Fine. 2 words. I could feel the confusion underneath them from across the house. Vivienne came to pick me up, which was her idea. She had a deliberate quality to her decisions that I had come to deeply respect. She didn't do things accidentally or symbolically. She did them because they were the right move, clearly and without drama. She arrived in a dark green wrap dress and her hair loose, which she usually kept tied back on the trails. She looked effortlessly composed in the way that confident people look when they've chosen not to make an occasion into a performance. She wasn't dressed to wound. She wasn't dressed to compete. She was just herself, fully, and that, as it turned out, was more than enough. I opened the door before she could knock. Natalie was in the kitchen. She heard the door and came around the corner with a dish towel in her hand, and the moment she saw Vivienne standing in the entryway of our home, I watched something shift in her face. It wasn't a dramatic expression. It was smaller and more honest than that, a brief rearrangement of her features that she recovered from quickly, but not quickly enough. She had expected something, a mousy consolation prize. Someone I'd found in haste or desperation. Someone who would validate her sense of superiority and confirm that she was the one holding the power in this situation. What she had not expected was Vivienne, who was standing in her doorway with a bottle of good Burgundy and a completely unguarded expression, entirely at ease. "You must be Natalie," Vivienne said, and offered her hand. I've heard a lot. It's good to put a face to everything. The everything landed perfectly. Not aggressively, but precisely. There was no way to decode it as hostile, but there was also no way to ignore what it implied. Natalie smiled, shook her hand, and said something polished about being glad to meet her. But I saw her eyes move to me for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction was something I recognized: recalibration. Owen and Claudia arrived 20 minutes later, and they are, to their credit, the kind of friends who understand immediately when they've walked into a complicated situation and conduct themselves accordingly. Owen greeted Vivienne warmly. Claudia, who has the social intelligence of a seasoned diplomat and the poker face of a professional card player, made effortless conversation without once acknowledging the visible undertow in the room. We ate. We drank. Vivienne was, as I had known she would be, exactly herself. Engaged, funny, knowledgeable without performing it, comfortable in the silence between subjects. She and Owen got into a 15-minute conversation about sustainable urban development that was genuinely the most interesting exchange of the evening. Claudia drew her out about her firm's work, and Vivienne described a recent project, redesigning the grounds of a school campus in a low-income district to include working gardens and natural drainage systems, with the kind of quiet passion that commands a room without demanding it. Natalie spent most of the evening being very good at looking like she was fine. I know her well enough to know how much effort that required. After dinner, Owen and Claudia moved to the living room, and Natalie stayed behind in the kitchen, ostensibly to deal with the dishes. I came in to refill drinks and found her standing at the sink with the water running, but not actually washing anything. "She seems nice," Natalie said, without turning around. "She is," I said. A pause. The water kept running. "How long?" she asked. "We've been friends for a few months," I said, which was true. "Things have developed more recently." Also true. Natalie turned off the tap. She turned around, and for the first time since her proposal 10 days earlier, her composure had a visible seam in it. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I know," I said. "That's not an accusation," she said quickly. She stopped, tried again. "I thought you would fight for us." I looked at her for a long moment. This was the conversation I had been composing in my head for weeks without knowing it. And now that it was here, I found I didn't need as many words as I had anticipated. "Fighting for us would have meant having a real conversation months ago, Natalie. What you asked me for 10 days ago wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. You'd already decided. You were just waiting for me to accept the terms." She didn't have an immediate answer for that. "I spent a long time," I continued, keeping my voice level, "trying to be the person who held things together while you figured out what you wanted. And at some point, I stopped and asked myself what I wanted. And the answer was someone who actually wants to be with me." The water had stopped. The house was quiet, except for the murmur of Owen and Claudia's conversation in the other room. "Is that her?" Natalie asked, and the question was smaller than anything she had said to me in months. Almost fragile. "It might be," I said. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." I picked up the wine glasses and went back to the living room. The aftermath of that evening unfolded over the following weeks in the way that endings usually do. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of smaller ones that accumulate into undeniable conclusion. Natalie retracted her request for an open relationship 3 days after that dinner. She said she'd been confused. She said she'd been going through something and hadn't handled it well. She said she missed us, the real us, the early version, the one that existed before things got complicated. She was articulate and sincere, and I believed her, because I know her well enough to know when she's performing and when she isn't, and she wasn't performing. But here's what I also knew. She hadn't missed us until she felt the ground shift. She hadn't wanted to protect what we had until she saw that I was no longer frozen in place waiting for her to decide what shape our life would take. The man she had calculated on, steady, accommodating, willing to absorb whatever terms she presented, had quietly stopped being that man somewhere on a hiking trail, in a 4-month series of honest conversations with someone who saw him clearly. I told her that I appreciated her honesty. I told her that I didn't think taking back a request undid the thing the request had revealed. I told her that I thought we had been unhappy for longer than either of us had been willing to admit out loud, and that her proposal, whatever she'd intended by it, had done us the small service of making that fact impossible to ignore anymore. She cried. I didn't. Not because I wasn't sad. I was, genuinely, in the way you are sad when you recognize the end of something that was real, even if it isn't anymore. But because I had already done most of my grieving in the months before the conversation, in the slow and private way that people grieve things they haven't officially lost yet. We agreed to separate. We were civil about it, which I think surprised both of us. There were lawyers and logistics and the quiet, bureaucratic sadness of dividing a life into columns, but there was no cruelty. I think we were both too tired for cruelty, and perhaps also too honest by the end, to pretend that cruelty was what either of us deserved. Owen told me later that Claudia had said, watching the dinner that night, that she had known within 10 minutes of meeting Vivienne that it was over for Natalie. I asked her what she meant. He said Claudia had put it this way. Natalie spent 6 years with a man who loved her more than he required her to earn it, and then she watched someone look at him the way she'd stopped looking at him years ago, and she realized what she'd been taking for granted. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that framing, but I understand it. Vivienne and I took things slowly, which was the right thing to do, and also surprisingly easy, because the foundation had been laid over 4 months of honest friendship before anything romantic had been declared. We hiked. We cooked together on weekends. We had the kind of long, unhurried conversations that I had forgotten were possible, about work and family and what we wanted our lives to look like in 10 years. Conversations that moved easily between serious and light, that never felt like auditions. She never asked me to justify the end of my marriage or position myself as the wronged party in a satisfying narrative. She wasn't interested in a story where she was the prize I'd won and Natalie was the villain I'd escaped. Real people are more complicated than that, she said once, and the situations they make are more complicated too. What mattered, she said, was what we were building, not the architecture of what had come before. I found that I agreed. There are things I understand now that I didn't when I was 32 and newly married, and certain that love, if sincere enough, was self-sustaining. I understand that relationships require tending in the same ongoing, active way that anything living does, that you cannot run them on momentum and expect them to stay healthy. I understand that security, real security, doesn't come from the other person's dependence on you, but from your own settled sense of who you are and what you offer, which no one else can grant or revoke. I understand that the version of loyalty that asks you to stand still while someone else moves freely in whatever direction they choose is not loyalty at all, but something that only resembles it from a distance. Natalie moved into an apartment across town. The last I heard, she was doing well. I hold no bitterness about it, not the performative kind where you claim you're fine and clearly aren't, but genuinely. The marriage was real. It mattered. Its ending was painful and also correct. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I've made my peace with sitting in that truth rather than resolving it into something simpler. People who have heard some version of this story sometimes say things like, "You got revenge," or "You beat her at her own game." I understand why it reads that way from the outside, and I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in the look on Natalie's face when she saw Vivienne standing in her doorway. I'm human. I won't perform a magnanimity I didn't entirely feel in that moment. But that framing misses what I think actually happened. I didn't bring Vivienne to that dinner to wound Natalie. I brought her because she was part of my life, because I was done shrinking that life into a shape Natalie had approved, because the only honest response to someone telling you they want freedom was to recognize that freedom moves in all directions simultaneously, or it doesn't move at all. What Natalie had miscalculated was simple. She had assumed my steadiness was passivity. She had mistaken patience for paralysis. She had looked at a man who was quiet and loyal and consistent and concluded that he would remain fixed while she determined the coordinates of her own happiness, that he was, in some essential way, waiting for her to point him in whatever direction she chose. She was wrong about that. I had been building something of my own, quietly, without announcement, not out of strategy or revenge, but because people who are paying attention to their own lives generally are. When she looked up from her planning, the landscape had rearranged itself. That is the actual story. Not a battle, not a game, not a performance of control. Just a man who stopped asking for permission to take his own life seriously and found that everything, including his own sense of himself, clarified considerably once he did. On a Saturday morning, about 4 months after Natalie and I signed our separation papers, Vivian and I were hiking a trail we'd done a dozen times, the one where we'd first had the long conversation about urban drainage systems that somehow lasted 6 miles without either of us noticing. The leaves were back on the trees. The light was the particular clean gold that comes in early spring, when everything is new and the air still carries a trace of cold. At the top of the ridge, where you could see 3 counties spread out below in the kind of landscape that makes you feel briefly and accurately small, she stopped and looked out for a long moment. "How are you actually?" she asked, the way she always asked it, as a real question, not a social reflex. I thought about it genuinely before answering, which is what she had always made space for. "I'm good," I said. And then, because it was true and she deserved the truth, "I'm better than I've been in a long time." She nodded, studying the horizon. Then she reached over and took my hand, not dramatically, just the easy, unannounced gesture of someone who has decided where she stands and doesn't need to announce it. We stood there for a while, looking out at all of it. That, I think, is the whole story.